Our topic for today is about environmental management system. And as you have learned, this is one of the tools of industrial ecology, the science of sustainable development. Now, why do we need EMS? Or you might ask, why is it that companies are claiming in their websites or in front of their gates when they get accredited with EMS? By the way, EMS is associated with what we call ISO standard. ISO means International Standard Organization. So ISO is actually in industry, there's what you call integrated management system. Now, in integrated management system, we have three components. So ISO 9000 is for QMS or quality management system. ISO 14000 is for EMS or environmental management system, which is our topic. And then finally, part of the integrated management system is the ISO 18000, which is about OHS. OHS is Occupational Health and Safety. So, we will focus on environmental management system. So, going back to the question, why do we need EMS, or why is it that the industries are actually claiming or bragging that they are accredited by ISO? Because number one, it's a worldwide trend. Why is it so? Remember, if they come up with the EMS, they would be complying with the international standards. So that would mean increase in their marketability. So, worldwide trend to focus on better environmental management would benefit the company in terms of higher marketability or wider marketability and thus having higher profit. Okay. Take note, class, that this is just an add-on function. Why? The question is ISO mandated by law? The answer is no. So why do you need to do this? Because, as mentioned, it is just an add-on function to integral part of business operations, because if they get accredited by International Standard Organization, they would have broader marketability and therefore higher profitability. So take note that this is not legislative driven but a strategy driven for the company. However, ISO 14000 would have some disadvantages, or let's say concerns. Number one is increased cost. You have to take note that if you undergo the ISO accreditation, take note that you have to undergo three of them. Although, as I mentioned, in the current trend in the industry, IMS is already done. IMS means Integrated Management System. You can have these three steps in one accreditation. Although in the case of MAPUA, we have just been accredited as ISO 9000 due to some documents that are still needed for the ISO 14000 as well as ISO 18000. But in some cases, or in most cases in industry, they do it 3-in-1. So that is your IMS. So take note that this process would be tedious as well as costly, because you have to hire a consultant for ISO, and then you also have to pay the accrediting body. So there are several ISO accrediting bodies that are regulated by the International Standard Organization. Number two is the possible non-tariff trade barriers. Because remember, your ISO accredited and therefore you have broader marketability, but problems on tariff trade would be one issue. Although nowadays globalization has answered already the tariff trade barriers. Then third, since it is voluntary and not mandated, most industries would not want to comply. But as mentioned, if the company would like to be competitive, it has to undergo EMS or ISO accreditation. For example, in Ayala, we do not accept suppliers or contractors which are not ISO accredited. And so, if you're not an ISO accredited, you cannot penetrate multinational companies like Ayala. Okay, the next one is the third-party registration issues. So what is this one? You recall, as mentioned, that you are the proponent, then you have the consultant, and then you have the accrediting body to give your accreditation. Normally, in the industry nowadays, the consultant may also be an accrediting body. So there might be a conflict of interest. So we cannot get rid of that. That's one of our socio-economic problem in terms of ISO accreditation. Because a company could not just be a consultant, in some cases it could also be an accrediting body. So for example, the company would find, this consulting firm would find a company to consult with the ISO. The problem is, this company, the consulting firm, would find another consulting firm or another company that would undergo or that would conduct the accreditation. So there might be some bias that may occur. So it will be the purpose of standardization. But our system has to be corrected if we will find ways on how to separate the identity of consulting firms as well as the accrediting bodies. Okay, but with those concerns, the key benefits would outdo the concerns. So what are some of the key benefits of EMS? Number one is management. So the EMS would involve management commitment. So it's a must. As a matter of fact, if you undergo an ISO audit, major component of this would be the management review. So that would ensure that all programs that will be established or that will be observed within the company are supported by the management. The next is legal. The minimum requirement for you to be an ISO accredited is you must comply with all legal requirements. So for example, in ISO 14000, you have to comply with all the RAs that we have discussed. RA 8749, Philippine Clean Air Act, RA 9275, Philippine Water Act, RA 9003, your Philippine Ecological Solid Waste Management Act, as well as RA 6969 about hazardous waste. Financial. As mentioned, this would increase marketability and therefore would increase profitability. Internal. Remember that if you're going to comply with the ISO standard, you have to arrange all the different departments that are involved in the process. And therefore, the different organizations will be standardized, and therefore all of the departments of the company will benefit. For example, if it is an ISO accredited company, if you are having problems with purchasing, because it would take you 48 years before you get the purchase materials, in ISO, if the company is an ISO accredited, the manual would or the procedure would include specific time on how to address the purchase requirement of one department. So there will be no red tape, there will be no bureaucracy because they have to follow the ISO standard. External, of course, is you're going to give more satisfaction to the customer. You have to take note, class, that EMS or all the ISO system or the ISO 9000, 14000, and 18000 would have this principle in mind. This is customer satisfaction. So, and because of the customer satisfaction, you have to undergo CQI. What's CQI? Continuous Quality Improvement. So this will always be your basis, the customer satisfaction. Thus, if you are given customer survey forms in restaurants or in some establishments, it is necessary that you have to fill it up because they need it for their ISO accreditation. They need it as a feedback of their services as well as the quality of the products so as to have continuous quality improvement. Okay, I mentioned that one of the benefits would be the management. So this will promote competitive advantage and improve environmental performance because one of the top priorities of the management is to come up with environmental management system. Okay, but of course, the management will also ensure that there is a balance on economic as well as environmental interests. Remember the sustainable development. As engineers, we are here so as to have technology or have development and for the companies that hire us to have profits. So we do not have to jeopardize economy or economic interests if we want to implement environmental interests. Now also, because management is overseeing the ISO accreditation, this would develop good industry practice. And normally, if they find it best practice, you would find these best practices in their websites. So why is it so? Why do they share it in their websites? Aren't they afraid of copying or plagiarism of this industry practice? But they would want to promote that they are the companies which develop good industry practices. And thus, in industry, the common trend is you have to share what you're doing. But of course, as mentioned, you also have to be careful in divulging some proprietary informations for the benefit of the company. And then, since the management is involved, they would encourage development and use of innovative technology because they would be backing up the budget for these innovations. Okay, next benefit would be legal. So this would improve legal and regulatory compliance because as I mentioned, the minimum requirement for an ISO accreditation is to be compliant with all environmental laws and regulations. And therefore, as mentioned, a company, if it is always complying with the regulations, it would enhance relationship with government authorities. So as mentioned, in terms of Ayala, since they were found to be in compliance, they were not just given a 1-year discharge permit but a 10-year discharge permit. This would benefit not only the company because it has to pay for a yearly annual fee for the discharge permit, but would also benefit the PCO, who happened to be me during that time. The pollution control officer need not to go to the LLDA nor go to EMB or DNR so as to renew the discharge permit because the pollution control officers need to be there personally to renew the discharge permit. So that would lessen the hassle of going to the government agencies. And then, this would access to government regulatory flexibility and permitting assistance, as I've mentioned in my example. Okay, financial. What would be the benefit in terms of financial? As reiterated several times, it would improve market share and operational cost. Operational cost because you remember the concept of eco-efficiency, ecological as well as economic efficiency. If you ensure that you have lesser waste, that would mean that you would have lesser costs on treatment. And therefore, the cost that you would be charging to the customer would not be for the treatment, but for the improvement of the quality of the product. And thus, if you also implement eco-efficiency, you would reduce penalty, liability costs, and insurance premiums. You remember, one of the concepts of sustainable development is aesthetic richness. So if you have a well-organized plant, you have a clean plant that would decrease accidents as well as insurance premiums and lesser damages to properties. And then this would have better access to the capital. Okay. Internal would, as mentioned, would involve the employees within the organization. So it will have more productive and efficient workforce. Everyone is happy, so everyone is efficient. Then more employment involvement. So it's very important in EMS that you conduct trainings. And if you involve your employee, this would enhance their morale. And then this would reduce training effort for employees. If after training for the initial accreditation, they know already what to do, so you would reduce the training efforts for employees. Okay, external would be for the clients as well as the community. So it will improve public image, it will enhance public and community relation. It would not be very good for a company to be always included in the top 10 polluters of Pasig River, for example. So it's very important that you have good public image. Then it will also reduce customer pressure because remember, in EMS, you always have in mind customer satisfaction. Okay, what does environmental management system is composed of? So you must have organizational structure, planning activities, responsibilities, practices, procedures, and processes. So in organizational structure, let's say you have in EMS, you might have different programs such as solid waste management program. So you must have a solid waste management program committee. So you must have the head, you must have the different identified key persons for the implementation of this program. For another example would be if you have your business continuity plan. So business continuity plan would include, for example, if there's a fire, what would be your safety organizational structure? So it has to be, you will see from different companies that they have organizational structures for these several programs posted so as to inform the employees. So for example, in the safety organizational chart, in case of fire, you would know who to tap or who to go to in case of emergencies. Then for the planning activities, it's very important for a company to do planning because you will learn later that this is part of your CQI. So in almost all industries, they conduct an annual planning. Even in Mapua, they have what you call planning for each department. And then we also have faculty congress wherein we have to plan what will be done for the next years of the industry operations. Then responsibilities. It's very important that if you will be an ISO accredited, you have the JD. JD is the job description. So it has to be explicitly mentioned in your job description document what are your responsibilities. Practices. Practices, procedures, processes are all documented. So you will learn that later as we go along with our discussion. And then of course, you also have to document your resources. As mentioned a while ago, the contractors as well as suppliers must be also ISO accredited, and therefore their documents have to be collected and must be compiled. And it has the one that is in charge with the lease of resources, particularly the purchasing, must ensure that these accreditation are renewed and updated. Okay, so what do they do for all the items that we have discussed? Number one, they will develop. So they develop the organizational structure, the best practices, the procedures, the processes, and then after developing what they will do, they need to implement. Now, upon implementation, they have to set a goal. So they have to achieve the target goal. In some cases, they call it key performance indicator. So for you as engineers, this will be the basis of your performance bonuses. So how do you set the goals or the target goals? Take note, class, that the minimum requirement is to comply with government regulations. So as long as you comply with the government regulations, the standard that you set will be based on what you can achieve. However, take note that EMS and the other management systems would implement the principle of CQI, or customer or continuous quality improvement. So from the word continuous, let's say for year 1 you set this target. In order to continuously improve the quality as well as your services, you cannot stop with that target. So through the years, the target has to increase. I'll give you an example. For example, in Mapua, since we're ISO accredited, we would set a target of, for example, in this course, we will set a target of, for year 1, 50% of the class would get a passing grade. Now, if continuously for the next successive or for the successive terms, we have complied already with the 50% target, the next year, we're supposed to come up with a higher percentage than 50%. So the same thing, because remember, in academe, students are our products. So in industry, if you set target of 50% compliant with quality control, and you continuously for the whole year achieve that goal, the next year you have to elevate your standard. Okay, and then if you cannot reach the goal, or if you can reach the goal, the next step is to review. So there's always a review period. So if you cannot reach the goal, that means you can maintain the target, definitely not lower the target because that's not improvement. So you still have to maintain the target, but if you're, as mentioned, if you're able to achieve it for successive terms, you have to increase it the next year. So that will be annual review. And then maintaining the environmental policy. As you do all of this, you have to make sure that the environmental policy is achieved. What is environmental policy? It's synonymous to your mission and vision of Mapua. So later we will find out how to prepare an environmental management policy. Okay, what are the principles you have to consider in EMS? Number 1, you have to see what would be the rank of environmental targets in the corporate priorities. But in most cases, since they want to achieve the IMS, they don't just get the QMS or the quality management system, but they also get the EMS. And since there's a need for safety, or there are several safety issues in most industries, so they also want to get the ISO 18000. So it's a current trend, but still you have to check whether the company prioritize your environmental management. And then second is, you have to emphasize pollution prevention. As mentioned, the minimum requirement of an ISO accreditation is to comply with government rules and regulations. And then you have to establish communication within the organization and constituents. And therefore, if a company is ISO accredited, there's a need to have a document controller. So what is this document controller? The document controller should have all the files of the procedures, the processes, and all documents that are needed for ISO accreditation. Normally, this document controller is under finance. Now, in terms of document control, how do they control the documents? They have the code. So, if you would notice, when Mapua was accredited ISO 9000 in year 2015, you would notice that all of your forms, the enrollment forms and other forms that you use, have already a code. So if you would compare it with the previous forms, there's already a code. So that is actually to control the documents because everything has to be communicated. So for example, if I am if I am the author of one procedure and I found out that I need to change some procedure, what do I need to do is I need to do a revision of the code. So normally the document is coded as whatever the code of the company is. And then at the last part of the code, there's what you call rev. Rev means revision. So there's rev 0, that means that's the first procedure. Then if you would want to revise it, you would have rev 1 and so on and so forth. Okay. And of course, you have to ensure that the management as well as the employees should have commitment to environmental protection. Now, in terms of management, there will be no problem, but in terms of employees, how do you do this? Especially with the rank and files. You have to do some information dissemination. So normally when you go to industries, they place some posters to promote, for example, on safety, they have the poster with safety first, or they have posters on zero waste. These would remind even the rank and file of the commitment of the company, from the management down to the employee. Then the EMS principle also encourages environmental planning throughout the life cycle of the product and or processes. So that means EMS is also can also make use of your LCA or life cycle assessment. And then improve the EMS by proper auditing and review procedure. With respect to audit, there's what you call, aside from the external audit conducted by the accrediting body, there's also what you call internal audit. So prior to the scheduled audit externally, an internal audit must be done. So for example, in Mapua, there's an internal audit team that would go to the different places or different departments to check whether we're complying with, let's say, 5S. 5S is about sorting, segregation, etc. in compliance with ISO 9000. So there's an internal audit. Okay, what would the EMS model contain? So one is, as mentioned, environmental policy, whatever you have planned, the implementation and operation. Again, all of this must be documented. And then you also have to include checking and corrective action if there's a need, as well as the management review. Okay, the EMS model follows a cycle. So this is the cycle. From the environmental policy, the vision and mission of the company, they would plan how to achieve it, they would implement and operate, then they will check and correct if there is a problem for management review. So if they have some recommendations, the management would approve or disapprove it. And then remember, it's a cycle because it follows the continuous quality improvement. Okay. So in order to do this, you have to do four things. So you have to plan, you have to do, you have to check, and you have to act. Under planning, you have to have the following. You must have the environmental policy. You must identify environmental aspects. You must comply with legal requirements. You have to reach your objectives and targets. And then you must come up with your environmental management program. So that's planning. After planning, you will implement. So these are the components. So structure has to be identified. Who will be the responsible persons? You have to conduct training for these persons. You have to communicate and document everything. And then you have to control the operations. Plus, you have to be ready with emergency. So what is this emergency preparedness? There's what you call BCP that is being implemented in most industries now. This is what you call business continuing plan. So that means if there are some disasters, just like fire, earthquake, tsunami, what else? Military threat, or even health threat such as MERS, HN1, you have to ensure that the business will be continuously working. So this would include the emergency preparedness plan. And then after doing, what's next? You have to check. How do you check? You monitor, you measure, you check whether there is non-conformance. If there's a non-conformance, you have to come up with corrective and preventive actions. And then you have to do a record of this. And then, you can only know this if you do internal audits. And then after that, what do you need to do? You have to act. So this would include review of the management and then implement whatever corrective and preventive actions are suggested. So as I have summarized, the plan, do, check, act cycle would include the plan, which would include these measures. Then under do, it includes these activities. Then for the check, you have to implement these strategies. And finally, for the act, you have to do these steps. Okay. It is important in EMS that the company establishes its environmental policy. What is environmental policy? It's a key tool in communicating the environmental priorities of one's organization to employees at all levels. So as mentioned, it's just like the mission and vision of environmental commitments of the company. It should be written clearly and concisely and be made publicly available. So if you would notice, when we have undergone our ISO 9000 accreditation, MAPUA have printed the missions and visions in several departments, and you can see them clearly and vividly in each department. Then environmental policy provides a set of guidelines to the organization to enable continuous improvement with regard to environmental issues. So this is the mission and the vision, this is the environmental policy. All succeeding plans and projects must be aligned with this policy. Okay, the environmental policy has three basic foundations. So it has to be, number one, compliance. Compliance with what? Compliance with the regulations of the government. It is committed for improvement. So you remember, you get the feedback from the customer, so you need to satisfy the customer. Therefore, after getting the feedback, you have to improve the process so as to meet this standard. And then finally, prevention. Prevention of what? Prevention of environmental impacts on air, water, land, and even to humans. So, environmental policy is a statement by an organization of its intention and principle in relation to its overall management performance. So, this has something to do with a framework for action and for setting of its environmental objectives and targets. So later we will define what are environmental objectives as well as environmental targets. So your environmental policy is appropriate to nature, scale, and environmental impacts of its activities, products, or services. And thus, here you can make use of your LCA as a tool. And environmental policy is your commitment to the three foundations: compliance, improvement, and prevention. Okay, so you have to determine also your environmental aspect. What is environmental aspect? It's the element of an organization, activities, products, or services that can interact with the environment. So you need to do an EHS, or environmental and health system EHS aspect identification. We will do that later. Now, how do you also have to identify, after identifying the aspect, that causes impact on the environment, you have to identify its impact. So what is environmental impact? Any changes to the environment, whether adverse or beneficial, wholly or partially resulting from an organization's activities, products, and services. So this is synonymous to the impact prediction in EIA, but this time you have to do it per process. You also have to conduct, in order to meet your environmental policy, you have to conduct initial environmental review. So what is this? It's initial comprehensive analysis of the EMS and the issues, impacts, and performance of activities at a site or at a process. The initial environmental review can be conducted as, number one, you have to identify the minimum legislative and regulatory requirements. You have to know your environmental aspect. And then for each activity, product, or services, then after that, you have to identify the significant environmental impacts as well as liabilities. After you have identified the aspect as well as the environmental impact, you have to do evaluation. So this is also synonymous to your impact evaluation. So what do you evaluate? You evaluate the performance compared with the relevant internal criteria. So there should be a standard that has to be met. External standards, that is normally the standard of the customer or the standard of professional organizations. Then you also have to evaluate whether it is in compliance with the regulations as well as codes of practice, your ethics, and then sets of principles and guidelines set by, let's say, a certain professional organization. Let's say you're in paint industry, so there are professional organizations that are setting standards for all paint industries and specific industries such as semicon, etc. In the initial environmental review, you have to review the existing environmental management practices and guidelines. Now, if you review this, you have to compare whether there are some corrective actions that have to be done. And also, in initial environmental review, you have to identify the existing policies and procedures dealing with procurement and contracting activities. If you find that there is a need to improve, that's the time you have to act after the initial environmental review. And then you also have to consider the feedback from investigation of previous incidents of non-compliance. And therefore, class, an ISO accreditation means you need not to cover the mistakes or the faults because this would hamper improvement. So you have to be very transparent of what's being done. However, in some cases or in most cases, industries normally cover the flows. Why? Because as mentioned, this would be the basis of your performance bonus. So if, for example, in the company that I used to work, the non-compliance of each department is being email blast, or being sent in email blast. So that means we would know what department would have the highest non-compliance. So that would also affect the image of the department, and thus they cover it. But again, if you're going to do the ISO audit objectively, you have to consider the feedback from the investigation of previous incidents of non-compliance so as to improve next time. Okay. In initial environmental review, you do not just identify the flows, but you also identify opportunities for competitive advantages. So if you happen to see some possible improvements, for example, you're going to do an energy efficient program in your process, you have to implement it, and then if there are positive impacts, you have to report it after the initial environmental review. And then in initial environmental review, you also have to consider the views of interested parties. This would include the suppliers, the contractors, the customers, the competitors, etc. Also, you have to identify functions or activities of other organizational systems that can enable or impede environmental performance. So that would also include, that is in relation to the views of interested parties. Now, after doing the initial environmental review, you have to measure the performance. So we call it environmental performance. This is the measurable results of the EMS related to an organization's control of its environmental aspects based on its policy, the environmental policy, the environmental objectives, as well as environmental targets. So it has to be measurable. So you remember a while ago I mentioned that in ISO 9000 that we conducted in Mapua, for each subject, we set what we call key performance area or key performance indicator. So 50% of the class should reach a passing grade. So that's a measurable quantity. So you also have to do that. For example, in the process, you have to set 50% of the products would pass quality control. So that's a measurable quantity. Okay. So the environmental performance is based not only on environmental policy but also on environmental objective. So what is environmental objective? It is the overall environmental goal arising from the environmental policy that an organization set itself to achieve and which is quantified where practicable. Take note, it is the organization that set the environmental objective as well as the environmental performance and environmental targets. Now, what is environmental target? It is a detailed performance requirement, quantified where practicable, applicable to organization or parts thereof, that arises from environmental objectives and that needs to be set and met in order to achieve those objectives. So this is related to your environmental performance. It has to be measurable. So that's your target. Now, target is not just quantity. It is also based on time. So for example, you would like to have zero waste. So for example, you have realized that there is generation of large quantities of waste, solid waste. But you cannot completely eliminate it in year one. So you can do a minimization of the waste by percentage. On year one, then increase the percentage of reduction of the solid waste in year 2, in year 3, and so on and so forth. So that is environmental target. Now, after setting all this and after reviewing the processes and the procedures, you have to come up with your environmental management program. What is this? It's a description of the means achieving environmental objectives and targets. Its details must be done by whom, how, and when for each of the defined objective and targets of high priority. So you remember a while ago, we set the organizational structure wherein you have to identify their responsibility, so the job description. So in the environmental management program, it's just like a plan wherein you have to identify who will do it, what will be done, how long it has to be done, and what is the target. Okay. So, in order to come up with a good EMS plan or program, management program, you have to do planning. So, what is planning? It needs to identify the boundaries, or in planning, what do you need to do? You need to identify the boundaries of its system, it can control, and over which it can be expected to have influence. So, you have to be realistic. So this is where you can make use of your life cycle assessment, wherein you have to set your boundaries. You also have to set your goal and scope. Okay, in planning, what are the things you have to consider? The legal and other requirements, the internal performance criteria, the environmental plan and management program, okay, which have to be implemented. So, your EMP, Environmental Management Program, upon implementation and operation, should focus on align people systems, strategies, resources, and structures to achieve environmental objectives. So, it has to be within your environmental policy. So, you notice in EMS, you have to set the models coherently with each other. Okay, how would you do this? You have to, number one, identify the structure and their corresponding responsibility. You have to have training, awareness, and competence. Now, normally in industry, this training is not on the cost of the employer. Normally, we give it to the suppliers or contractors. So, for example, they would be selling us an equipment. We want to train our engineers to operate and to maintain the equipment, a sophisticated equipment, for example, because normally it is being operated by the technical operator. So the engineers will be sent by the supplier or the contractor for a training, local or international, and then that engineer will echo the training to the operators. So that's one strategy so as to minimize the cost on the employer. And then you have to communicate internally. So if there are some changes that have to be done, you have to internally communicate. Now in ISO, emails are considered as accepted documents for the internal communication. Internal communication would also include memos. So if you have memo coming from your boss, this has to be checked. Now, environmental management documentation and document control, as I have reiterated a while ago, these have to be done by a document controller. Then, the code must be known by the entire organization. And also, the implementation and operations would include, as mentioned, the BCP or the Business Continuity Plan for Emergency Preparedness and Response. Okay, now you have already your plan. You have done your review, initial environmental review. The next thing is you have to do checking and corrective action. Now, this would involve measuring, monitoring, and evaluating key activities of EMS so as to ensure that the organization is performing in accordance with the stated environmental management plan. So, this would involve air quality monitoring, water quality monitoring, evaluation of the performance of the process, let's say your energy consumption, your water consumption, your raw material consumption. So all of this must be monitored and measured. So recordings of data will not stop upon your graduation after your laboratory classes. So you still have to do the recording of this data in industry, especially if the company that you'll be working with is under ISO 40000. Now, in the checking and corrective action, if you find some non-conformance, there should be corrective and preventive action. In ISO, there's a form that has to be complied. Normally, let's say the external audit is done today. Okay. You have to record also the non-conformance. Now, the non-conformance, as mentioned, it has to be transparent so as to have quality improvement. Now, normally, the non-conformance is identified within the audit if the external auditor can come in. The corrective and preventive action forms must be completed within the day. So, you have to stipulate there what not necessarily, stand corrected, not necessarily within the day, but with a specific period of time. But the non-conformance will be given to the person involved or in charge to identify the corrective and preventive action. If I'm not mistaken, it's within 30 days. So if you happen to be issued with a non-conformance, you have to come up with a preventive action and corrective action within 30 days. Then, you have to have records of this, and the succeeding corrective and preventive actions attachments must be recorded as well. And then, on the next audit or internal audit, it has to be reported. Okay. Under the review and improvement, as mentioned, CQI is the governing principle of EMS. So, you have to achieve overall improvement in environmental performance after a cycle. And then the cycle will keep on or will continue so as to achieve improvement. Okay. Now, when you do the review, what are the things that would be included? You have to review, so that's the outline, you have to review the environmental objective and targets. You have to review also the findings, for example, the non-conformance of EMS audit, whether it's internal or external audit. You have to evaluate the effectiveness of the audit. You have to evaluate the suitability of the environmental policy. And if needed, it has to be changed. For example, we have revised already our mission and vision. But of course, it would not be totally new from the original environmental policy. And then, the changes must be in line with if there are some changing legislation, there are some changing expectation and requirements of interested parties, there are some changes in the products or activities, you have to induce some advances in science and technology, or there are some lessons learned from environmental accidents, or there is a change in market preference, or reporting and communication has to be updated. Okay, so this is actually a model that shows you continual improvement. Take note, class, it's a cycle, therefore you can start anywhere. But of course, as we have discussed, you have to follow the outline so as to know where to start. Okay, it's important to reiterate that in order to have continual improvement, you have to identify area for opportunity for improvement of the EMS. So for example, if you say that there is no non-compliance, what should you do? You will not be stuck up with your existing procedure. You have to identify possible areas of improvement. So as mentioned, you can innovate. You can share your learned practices. For example, in Ayala, where I used to work, we have implemented several energy conservation program. For example, since it's a waterworks operations, what we did was we have implemented pressure valves. What are these pressure valves for? So you remember, we are in waterworks operations, we are committed to give 20 to 25 PSI. But of course, you cannot do it 24/7 because that would be energy consuming. So what we need to do is we have to set up some pressure bulbs in some key points so as if the need of the customers would be lower, the pressure that is lower, for example, during night or during dawn or madaling araw. So what will happen is the pressure bulb has a sensor that will automatically lower the pressure. So in that case, the pump that we're using would be minimizing its energy consumption. And other energy conservation programs. And for that, we're able to join an energy, it's not a competition, but it's an energy program of DOE, Department of Energy, wherein we won as a company under the category of saving 1 million pesos in a year. by just implementing these energy conservation programs. So that's one way of identifying possible opportunities for improvement. And then in continual improvement, you also have to determine the root cause or causes of non-conformance or deficiencies. Now here, LCA is very important in identifying the root cause. Then you have to develop and implement plans of corrective and preventive actions to address the root causes. And you have to document everything. Okay. And then the work doesn't stop there because you have to verify the effectiveness of your corrective and preventive actions. You have to document any changes in procedures resulting from processes improvement. In that case, as mentioned a while ago, you have to indicate the revision. Rev 0, Rev 1, Rev 2, and so on. And then you have to make comparisons with objectives and targets, whether you are conforming with targets and objectives.